Hello, my name is Josh Bronson, and on behalf of the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives, or NALI, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Officer-Involved Stalking, Uncovering the Hidden Realities. For those of you unfamiliar with NALI, we were created out of the need to have a police association to address the unique needs of women in law enforcement. NALI provides mentorship, leadership, and a space for a community made up of people who support women in policing. NALI believes that as part of strengthening the law enforcement response to crimes such as stalking, domestic violence, and sexual assault, we also need to engage in difficult conversations like this one about response to these crimes when the perpetrator or the victim is also a police officer. Officer-involved crimes like these are issues of officer safety and wellness, and NALI is committed to addressing this important and overlooked aspect of response to stalking, domestic violence, and sexual assault. We are also grateful to have such strong partners in this work at organizations like Spark and programs like OVW LETAC, who will be presenting to you today. NALI is a proud member of OVW LETAC and can assist you with obtaining training and technical assistance at no cost through OVW LETAC. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Jen Landis and Sergeant Denise Jones to take things away. Thank you, Jen and Sergeant Jones, for being with us today. Over to you.
Thanks, Josh. Hi, everyone. My name is Jen Landheis. I am the director of the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center. We are funded by the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to do training and technical assistance as it relates to stalking. And so as part of that endeavor, we oftentimes partner with our good friends at LETAC and of course with Josh and all the folks at NALI. So Denise, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Sergeant Denise Jones. I work for the Clark County Sheriff's Office in Springfield, Ohio. And one of the things that I do on a regular basis is I do stalking investigations. I've been in law enforcement for about 25 years, a little over 25 years. I do work with Jennifer at Spark, and I also work for the Law Enforcement Training and Technical Assistance Consortium, which is an OVW-funded program that provides free support to law enforcement agencies and their partners. Josh and I are both subject matter experts for LETAC and come and support you in your local jurisdictions if you should so need it.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining us. If you wouldn't mind, since we're a little bit of a smaller group, you can go ahead and put in the chat who you are and where you're from. That just allows Sergeant Jones and I to get a good idea of who's on with us today. So we're not just talking at each other, but we just want to start off by highlighting some of the recent headlines that involve officer-involved stalking cases. And know that we're going to approach the webinar today not only from officers involved as perpetrators, but officers involved as victims as well. So knowing that we're going to try to cover both sides of the coin today and talk about some of these cases and what we can do as far as policy and response goes, but definitely want to hear from all of you because you're all experts as well. So chime in the chat. We'll make sure we're monitoring that as we go forward. So just pulled some headlines. Unfortunately, it didn't take much to pull some headlines from some of the local papers and across the country that were highlighting some of these particular cases. We're going to try to cover not only intimate partner related stalking, but stalking that's not conducted or related to intimate partner violence. So we want to make sure that we have an adequate discussion that's covering both sides there. We're going to use this particular definition when it comes to addressing stalking, knowing that you're all attending from different jurisdictions across the US. And so we're going to use a behavioral definition that really focuses on the fact that the offenders in these cases are oftentimes extremely creative. They're varying the tactics that they're using to try to intimidate the victims in these particular cases. And that as a result of that targeted behavior, that the victims, as well as others close to them, so their coworkers, their families, are suffering some kind of substantial emotional distress or fear. And we also want to point out, as we're looking at this, that the way these cases come in are not simple of someone walks in and says, hey, I think I'm being stalked, let's look at it, but rather some very nuanced reporting mechanisms. And so, Denise, anything you want to chime in there from the standpoint of trying to fit these, what we know is happening in these cases into your criminal definitions?
Yeah, absolutely, Jen. So I know we started out with the recent officer-involved stalking cases, and some people would think like, why are we even looking at those? But overreaching, when we talk about gender-based violence crimes and we talk about working with victims, one of the things I think we don't take into consideration is victims watch how we treat other victims. And more importantly, they watch how we treat perpetrators, especially when those perpetrators could be a part of our own law enforcement family. So I think it's important for us to understand when we look at headlines nationally, I mean, we all get on social media, we all see headlines from all over the US, not just from where we're centrally located, right? But victims see those same headlines. And so when they see those headlines and they see like the penalties that come with stalking in a regular case, then penalties that come along when that officer is the perpetrator, that could affect how they come to us if they are a victim of officer perpetrated stalking, especially when it's one of our own, right? But when we look at stalking definition, we look at that behavioral aspect. Not every behavior in and of itself is going to be something that's going to trigger an immediate criminal code violation. What we really need to focus on are are the fact that that when we talk about stalking, it is a pattern of behavior. So we need to start identifying those co-occurring crimes or identifying what that pattern can look like. I've had a stalking case several years ago in the infancy of me doing stalking investigations in this particular position that I am now, where a female would report that someone was putting money in their mailbox. So when we identified that victim came to us and said, hey, someone's putting money in my mailbox. And our response was, well, you should be happy someone's putting money in your mailbox. We've lost that victim, right? So imagine that victim being a victim of officer perpetrated. Imagine that person being one of our own and seeing how we're handling that with outside victims. But when we look at the behavioral aspect of stalking, again, not everything is going to trigger an immediate criminal code violation, right? So we need to be able to identify what stalking behaviors are and then start plugging those in and develop that course of conduct or that pattern of conduct that's going to help us get to that stalking charge.
And I think to that point, Denise, one of the things that can be difficult in these particular situations is a lot of times we have conversations with jurisdictions all across the country and we're like, do you have a policy on officer involved domestic violence? Do you have a policy on officer involved sexual assault? And everybody's like, yes. And then we say, what about officer involved stalking? We kind of get the deer in headlights, like, because people are like, well, we don't have that many reports. We don't know that it's an issue here. And I'm always a little surprised by that, knowing that the prevalence rates for stalking are just as high, if not higher, than domestic violence and sexual assault. But also keep it in mind that oftentimes if departments have some type of policy, it's usually kind of dovetailed into their policy about officer involved domestic violence. And that's awesome. And at least stalking's covered in there. And there's always the concern about what if we have a situation where it's not intimate partner involved? What about those acquaintance situations where either someone's using their power as an officer to engage in stalking behavior, or they're being stalked by somebody that they had interaction with on a traffic call or something like that? And so just keep in mind that as we're asking you to start thinking deeply about your policies and your procedures, making sure that those policies and procedures are covering all potential stalking victims and perpetrators, not just intimate partner stalking. Denise, you look like you were going to jump in and say something.
Yeah, so just to echo on your point, Jen, I think nationwide we struggle sometimes because we expect the victim to identify stalking behavior, and so we need to make sure that we're aware of what that stalking behavior looks like. Not dependent on the relationship with that person, especially in these particular cases, or when it's something that isn't a former or current intimate partner. So it's really important for us to understand what that looks like and be able to help that victim identify that as we start working and start having those conversations so we can get them to the reporting stage faster. I believe the last number that I knew, it took 6 to 12 months for victims to report to us if they ever reported to us. So that's important for us to start helping them identify that earlier versus later, so we can kind of intercede at a more earlier rate versus waiting for it to get to a more prolonged problem.
And I think you point out a issue that we see in these particular cases, regardless of who's involved, but especially when it comes to officer involved stalking cases, is really understanding and teasing out the stalking behaviors. I think we all fall victim to the fact that, you know, stalking conjures those images of somebody, you know, peeping through the window blinds or following somebody. And I think really trying to take a bird's eye perspective of these particular cases and understanding all the different dynamics that are in place and all the different behaviors that are happening. Because what we oftentimes see is, even if you have somebody who's very familiar with what stalking is, or what their criminal definition is, that they don't necessarily identify some of the things that happen in these particular cases as part of the stalking course of conduct or that pattern of behavior. And what we oftentimes see is that when we're having conversations, when we're doing interviews, when we're looking at stalking cases, that people really focus on the surveillance behavior, the stereotypical stalking behavior, and that we fail to necessarily understand all the other different categories of stalking behavior. I've always found it really helpful to use this particular framework when it comes to looking at stalking cases. And we call this the SLI framework. I'm old, I have to have an acronym for everything. So SLI stands for surveillance, life invasion, interference, usually happening through some kind of sabotage or attack, and then intimidation. And when the surveillance behavior is happening, and this, I think it's important to note that this framework doesn't come from like Jen's brain, because then it would have no credibility, but rather it was put together by a researcher who was really trying to encompass all the different behaviors that happen in these particular cases. And so she interviewed tons of perpetrators, tons of victims in stalking cases, and really tried to categorize all the different behaviors that she was hearing from these individual cases. And the surveillance behavior is usually the stuff that, if a case is going forward, if a victim, as Denise says, comes forward and makes a report, which we know is probably going to be delayed, is probably not going to use the words stalking, that it oftentimes is containing surveillance behavior, because that's the stuff that there's more evidence for. It's the stuff that might at least trigger a thought to somebody that this isn't okay. Whether they call it stalking or not might depend. But a lot of times this is where you have offenders who are inserting themselves either into like the physical following pieces of things, but of course, now with also all the social media aspects, the social media aspect. And so as you look at this particular slide, thinking about the ways that this shows up in officer involved stalking, I think there's a couple of things that we can tease out. Is there anything that stands out to you, Denise, as you look at this particular behavior that you've seen in some of your officer involved cases?
So following and then showing up. But one of the things that we need to, I kind of flesh out, I guess, is if this is an intimate partner case, let's say, for instance, whether it be officer perpetrated or officer as a victim, a lot of this stuff, it's almost like a grooming process, right? So we have to understand that if it's an intimate partner case or there's some kind of relationship there, some of these things may be normalized by the offender. So we need to be prepared for that. One of the things that we use is a power control wheel, which can be beneficial. We really try to talk about barrier breakdown and what that looks like for a victim. But overreaching, when we look at surveillance, it's going to be following. It's going to be showing up. Sometimes where you don't even understand how that perpetrator knew where you were going to be. And social media plays a role in that. So as officers, I'm a big proponent of privatizing your social media. I don't think everybody should have access, free and unfettered access to your social media, but we put our lives out there for people to see on a daily basis. So one of the things we have to understand is we're also giving people access to see where we're at on a regular basis. But a lot of following, a lot of showing up. When you talk about tracking software for officer perpetrated, it's a lot easier for us. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the presentation. But then obtaining information about victims is easier for us as well. Again, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But again, I would really hone in on the following or showing up or waiting for someone, waiting for them to get out of work, waiting for them to get to work. It would just be dependent on that victim. And it really relies on us asking good questions. Once we're sitting down with that person, having the ability to really ask good questions and giving them the space to give us those answers, maybe not in a chronological way. They may come in and say, like, I think I'm going crazy. just sit down and be prepared to listen to their information, listen to their account of events, and then go back and ask questions. And then you'll find that you might get a better interview and be able to kind of pull out some of this information a little bit better than just a traditional face-to-face, I'm out at your house interview that has to be done quickly, because as law enforcement officers, we're doing more and more with less and less.
Absolutely. I think both for the surveillance category behavior as well as the life invasion piece of things, I've often seen officer involved cases with officers as perpetrators that victims have come in and said that the reasoning behind the offender's behavior was that, because of my job, people don't like me, et cetera. And so I'm worried they're going to start following you. And so really, I'm just concerned for your safety. So I'm showing up here, I'm following you, I'm coming to work, I'm calling you, et cetera, to check in on you because I'm concerned about your safety. And so trying to use that element of the dangerousness of their own jobs and how that spills over into their potential partners, et cetera, as a reasoning for their behavior and a justification for some of the things that they're doing. So thinking about, how is that offender inserting themselves into the victim's life? And so is that trying to, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in depth later, but is it creating issues at work? So if you have a victim as a stalking victim as a law enforcement officer, am I going to try to discredit them at their place of employment? Am I going to try to make them look weak, or that, they're lying, or they're setting things up in a way that is going to discredit them or embarrass them in front of their coworkers in their department? I think as well, the aspect of intimidation. Obviously, that's an easy one when we think about officers as perpetrators, but officers as victims as well, who are thinking about, I'm going to be looked at differently. There's that intimidation and reputation factor that goes into there, as well as the what we see in a lot of these particular cases. If we have law enforcement as victims of stalking, an offender who will threaten to harm themselves and then say, well, everybody's going to look at things differently. If you couldn't even keep your own partner alive, if something happened to me, everybody would look at what your reaction was, et cetera. Denise, anything else you want to add to that?
Yes, when I look at this list, I look at forced confrontations. We work at government agencies, right? We work at public buildings, so I can't avoid someone, right? If they show up at my public building, that might be a forced confrontation. And then the threaten to or actually harm themselves. I mean, if you are working in the same jurisdiction where you live, who wants repeated calls to their home for calls of service, right? So offenders know that. Offenders know the things that they can do to push buttons to get you in trouble, whatever that may look like. It's a little bit easier, I think, as officers being the victim of stalking, because we are so accessible, right? Everything we do is public information. And so like we have to run this fine line of what that looks like, and how do agencies protect us should we become the victims of stalking.
And the last category that we didn't cover, but we did, was talking about the interference. So how is that perpetrator interfering with every aspect of the victim's life? And so, that professional aspect, that personal aspect, the safety aspect, all of those things playing out. And I think the takeaway from all of this is really to, not figure out like, oh, if you have this particular situation, where does this fit neatly into our category of sly behaviors, but rather just broadly thinking about all the things that happen in stalking cases. We know that even as folks who are used to gathering information, building these cases, when people are asked, tell me about the other stalking behaviors, they typically focus on the surveillance piece of things, and they don't necessarily think to include the things that, like, they're trying to sabotage their work, and they're, interfering with my friends and family, and they're, making me look bad in front of everybody else. And so really trying to think broadly about those, because what we typically have happen is, if it is 12 to 15 months before somebody comes in and makes a report, and they're sitting across from you and you're trying to tease out everything that's been happening, that's a lot of time to have passed. That trauma is going to affect that person, that reporting party's memory and their ability to recall everything that's been happening. And rather than saying, well, tell me about the other things that have happened, asking specific questions about some of these behaviors that you see outlined in the SLIDE framework can start to open that door for victims having more information to be able to report to you. And we all know the more information we get, the better our reports are, the better we are to build the case. Denise, anything else you were going to add?
Yeah, so when you look at this and you put all of these things together, I think as officers, we hyper focus on physical safety, right? But working with a ton of stalking victims over the past several years, especially, I know Jen keeps hitting on it, we've talked about it already, the length that it takes potentially for even to report, if they ever report, whether that be a non-law enforcement victim or a law enforcement victim. What we don't think about is the mental health aspect, right? So when we talk about stalking cases and the length that it takes to report, the length that it takes if it ever goes through the criminal justice system, a lot of times what we don't see is that mental decline, right? We hyper focus on keeping ourselves physically safe, but when you talk about interference, financial and work sabotage, ruining my reputation, potentially if we're both officers at the same jurisdiction, what's that custody piece going to look like? So we have to put all of these things together and just understand it's hard enough to work with non-law enforcement victims of stalking. I promise you, law enforcement officers on this webinar here, we are the worst victims. We are very difficult. As organized and as detailed as we are, we don't even want to see ourselves as victims. And that's where we have to kind of help each other out. And again, it goes back to being able to identify these behaviors and then being able to have these conversations with our coworkers on kind of help them get to where they need to be sooner versus later on in their case.
And I think one of the things that we also want to really highlight, and we mentioned it at the beginning of our webinar today, was talking about what happens when it's not an intimate partner situation, because many of us have officer involved intimate partner violence policies, procedures. Those cases have come up before, we maybe know what to do with them. But I think it's important to also recognize that in your intimate partner violence cases, that oftentimes the stalking element is overlooked, that it's kind of chalked up to the typical dynamics that happen in those particular cases. And so when you have somebody who's threatening suicide, when you have somebody who's really interfering, all of us are pretty well trained to be like, oh, that happens in the power and control and intimate partner violence, and not necessarily say, or is this also patterns of behavior that's causing somebody else to be fearful? And could it also be stalking as well? And we have a lot of conversations with officers across the country who will say things like, well, does it really matter if we call it stalking or if we call it intimate partner violence? Like, we've got a policy on IPV, we'd be fine to be able to handle those particular cases. And recognizing that when that stalking element is happening, in addition to and as part of the intimate partner violence, we have some of our more lethal cases. Add to that, you have people who are readily armed and have easy access to firearms. Then people oftentimes miss the fact that when the stalking element is happening, that it increases the potential lethality in these particular cases. So if you're already working on an intimate partner case that's officer involved, and you also have the stalking element, then you have a victim who is in 3 times greater danger of being killed by that other party. And so keeping in mind that that risk factor is there, and being able to understand that there are particular risk factors that are inherently different in stalking cases that might not be risk factors in domestic violence cases. And so if you're not familiar with some of the risk factors in stalking cases, absolutely encourage you to check out the stalking risk assessment. We link to it on Spark's website. It's called SHARP. It's the Stalking, Harassment, Assessment, and Risk Profile. But essentially what it does is call out the 14 risk factors in stalking cases that you see on the screen in front of you. And one of the things that I want to point out is within the stalker's history, if you have somebody who has access to firearms or training on those firearms, it increases the risk factors. So inherently with officer involved stalking cases, you have at least one risk factor present, because it doesn't mean that the perpetrator necessarily has access to a weapon. It can be that the victim has access to a weapon as well. So just putting that out there as we delve more into figuring out, like, what does this look like? And what are some of the unique dynamics that are present in some of our officer involved stalking cases? Denise, you want to take the lead on
Yeah, so when you look at the unique dynamics of officer-involved stalking, we have access to so many things that other regular random folks don't, right? So I know officers are on here, we're familiar with leads, we run people through leads on a regular basis in the course of our normal duties. Most of us use computer-aided dispatch systems that are directly linked to our reporting systems. We have a myriad of different tools at our disposal, TLO. There are so many things that we can use to look up individuals, and we don't need a lot of information to do that. Again, social media can be a great resource. If you've never taken an open source class, open source investigations class, the amount of open sourced information that we put out there is it's scary, right? And so we as officers are no different than regular victims that we encounter on a regular basis. We're still putting out the same information, right? We're still using the same things that everyone else uses. So as an officer perpetrated stalker, I can get those open source websites, but I can also use what my law enforcement agency gives me at my disposal every day. So when we're talking about the sensitive information and the private details that people get on open source, I can get deeper. I can get your criminal case history. I can get all the places that you lived. I can get all of your driver's license photos. I can get the next of kin. I can get your phone number. I can get your business address. I can get your email addresses, right? With little to no effort on my part. So one of the things that we need to look at as individuals that work in these agencies and potentially people that are writing policies, like Jen already hit on it, are we just delineating a stalking policy by itself, not just intimate partner violence related, to make sure that we cover all of the officers that work in our jurisdictions. When you look at the systems that you're using on a regular basis, are those systems set up to track logins? You know, one of the things that we had here was not an officer perpetrated, but the person was a prominent member of society. Are you tracking printable reports? So can someone from my agency who may be friends with someone from another agency, we're friends, I'm going to ask you for that report. Are we able to track who's printing off reports? Are we able to timestamp, date stamp, and then name stamp reporting system? So we use Oleg for us. That is something that as soon as I go in and look someone up, it time, date, and name stamps, and I have my own login. What are we doing when we're talking about sharing logins? I know we are so inundated with operating system and internet security systems, webinars and tests. We do them annually here at our agency, making sure that we're not sharing our login codes. I know it sounds so ridiculous, but if I'm an officer perpetrated stalker and you leave your desktop open and I need to make sure that no one tracks this stalking request back to me, then I'm going to use your logon, right? And if we're all working in the same office space, it's not that hard. I'm guilty of it, walking away, leaving my computer up, thinking, oh, I work with cops. Like, they're not going to touch my computer, right? But it's something that we leave ourselves vulnerable to. Other technology that can help facilitate stalking are the flock cameras that are all the rage right now, right? If I type in a vehicle description, I don't even have to type in a license plate. If I type in a vehicle description, I can start picking up where my victim's going, especially if it's in a smaller area. I know where that person may or may not work, go to school, frequent as far as a gym, social events, grocery stores. I can look at those flock cameras and I will eventually get that plate, even if I'd never seen that plate before, right? So we have a lot of tools. We put up poll cams for various investigations. What does the access look like for your officers to check out those poll cams or request those poll cams or put poll cams up? License plate readers, amazing tools, right? They're not only stationary, but they're on our vehicles. Something I can make my own hot list on the license plate reader. So I'm tracking that person anytime that they get popped by another license plate reader, or I'm driving through and I'll just see a license plate pop up. I may watch that person get into that car, and now I'm starting to pull their private information to track them down.
And I think to your point, Denise, one of the things that we hear from lots of victims of officer involved stalking is that belief that the offender is omnipresent. Regardless of whether they have access to all this technology that you just listed, the victim believes that they do. And so that safety plan that usually kicks into place for lots of victims of stalking who are trying to isolate and insulate themselves against things. If they truly believe that this person has unfettered access to everything, that's going to contribute to their mental health. It's going to contribute to their likelihood to come forward. If I come in and make a report, is somebody going to see that? Even if I drive to the other jurisdiction, would my offender know that if I went to the other jurisdiction? So I think that plays into account that in these particular cases, regardless if someone does have access to it, victims often believe that there's unfettered access and that they're omnipresent. And that leads to oftentimes that fear of, I don't trust anybody. There's no way I can come and report this. I believe that everybody, supports and believes in this person. And if I come in and make a report, no one's going to believe my side of the story, right?
Well, not only that, Jen, like everybody watches CSI, 48 Hours, 2020, whatever it may be.
Wait,
right?
those aren't true?
So, I mean, we're looking at the technology that's available to law enforcement agency. We're down from rural all the way up to some of these jurisdictions that are on here now that have a decent, maybe their own stalking unit, right? I was just down at Nashville Metro. Their center that's set up is amazing. They're stalking their citizens. I mean, but for good reasons, right?
Yeah.
So everybody's watching these crime shows and they see all of the things that we have at our disposal. So when you look at that and a normal stalking victim get to the point where they just self-isolate, like you talked about, imagine having an officer as your perpetrator. I automatically assume, like if the normal offender is here, it doesn't even take a conversation for me to think that officer is here. And if that is an intimate partner relationship, I've made that victim aware of what I'm capable of. Like I've made that victim aware of my omnipresence. I know everybody. Everyone assumes that all law enforcement officers know each other and communicate on a regular basis. I wish, right? For good reasons. But when we look at the officer as a perpetrator, those access to tools that facilitate stalking, they're numerous. They're plenty. They're bountiful. And it doesn't take a lot to get access to that. I can pull up some stuff, TLO. I use it every day for my investigations. I have access to it, right? So there are tools that are tangible for us. It just takes an email address for me. They verify that back to my email address. Maybe they'll verify it through my immediate supervisor, but I just go to my immediate supervisor. Hey, like I need this for my normal investigation. So no one thinks or is the wiser of why I may be potentially using it. And then again, we talked about it in the third or fourth slide. We're looking at all of these national headlines. What as agencies are we doing to hold officers accountable? When you look at stalking as the crime of itself, let's take officer perpetrated, officer victim out of it for just a second. A lot of juries, a lot of judges don't see that as a physical crime. They don't see that as a crime of violence. They don't see that for what it really is. Like it completely uproots victims, right? It makes it to where that victim doesn't trust anything, including themselves, anyone. They don't go anywhere. They change so much. They may move. They may change their phone numbers. They may change jobs multiple times over and over again. Now imagine that as an officer perpetrated or as an officer victim. How am I going to change jobs? If I'm a female officer, what are my male counterparts going to think of me? I can't be a victim, right? When you're looking at officer perpetrated, I can paint that narrative before you ever try to report. Before that victim ever comes through, I can start with that victim immediately, especially if it's an intimate partner. Oh, I know everybody. I'm on our SWAT team here. Like I know everybody. I wear a train with the jurisdictions all around me. I can paint that picture. I can paint the picture for the victim. I can paint the picture for my fellow officers, right? Oh, this lady's stalking me. This guy's stalking me. They're doing A, B, and C. So I'm going to paint you as the perpetrator. And let's face it, like, who are people going to believe?
Right.
When we talk about trauma, not to get off this particular topic, but when we talk about trauma and we talk about gender-based violence crimes, I, as an officer involved in a critical incident, I'm believed immediately. We have such a struggle believing victims of gender-based violence when we talk about domestic violence, stalking, strangulation, protection order violations, and sexual assault, right? So imagine me as an officer painting the picture when I'm the perpetrator and that's the victim, and I paint myself as the victim. Now I've already tainted the jurisdictions around me or my own organization or my community partners before that victim ever tries or decides to report. So it is very detrimental to victims as in an officer perpetrated stalking case. So what are we doing as agencies to hold officers accountable? What are we doing to put mechanisms in place? Should we have somebody that's going to report against one of our officers? Imagine that officer that everybody thinks about and they think, oh, it would never be them. And then it's them. Who's going to believe that victim? Like, we struggle already.
Absolutely. I think that you're also leading us down the road to, as we're thinking about officers as victims, kind of started to tease out, like, what happens if a report is made? Who does the report get made to? Who are people bringing in? Like, what happens in these particular cases? Because not only do we have victims who are worried about their own believability and credibility, but also worried about, who is this getting out to? Like, if I come in, who's going to find out what's going on, right?
Right, absolutely. And so when you think about an officer as a victim, let's say that it's another officer who is the perpetrator. I know what training you've taken. I know where all of the flock cameras are. I know how to circumvent certain things. But what partnerships are we putting in there to help our officer victims? Are they going to come and report to their own agency? What is the stigma on that, right? Are we making it a safe place for people to come in and report? Have we went out and sought partnerships that aren't affiliated with our own agency? So we here at the Clark County Sheriff's Office, we work with a lot of community-based advocates. For those of you that aren't aware, community-based advocates for us, they aren't affiliated with us. They're typically non-governmental organizations and they have confidentiality. Right. So I make those relationships. So my officers know they work with these advocates on a regular basis, which can also be a barrier for them to go to those advocates. But they know that they can speak to our advocates and that information would never get back to me because of the confidentiality. So what partnerships are you putting in place? Let's think about if we had to investigate one of our own officers, if we had to protect one of our own officers who is a victim. What's that going to look like for reporting? Am I going to ask a jurisdiction to come in? Am I going to set up an MOU so my officer to protect them from get a public records request? Am I going to send them to an adjacent county? Am I going to send them to an adjacent maybe place in my jurisdiction so they can report? What's that going to look like? Because I want to try to protect my officer as the victim, right? I want to hold offenders accountable. But as an officer, like everything that I do is subject to public records requests. So one of the victims that I've worked with, who is an officer victim, we make sure that when this person comes in, they're not on their work time. They don't text me from my personal phone to their personal phone. Everything is done above board, right? I don't want someone to come in and say that I gave a victim treatment that I shouldn't have. I want to treat them just like I would treat everybody that comes in, and I treat everyone that comes in my office. I start by believing, right? I let them have a trauma-informed space to report to me. I want to make sure that they know that I'm going to take them seriously. Are there organizations that can help you come right in, right? Do I want to put them with a community-based advocate before they ever speak with me? Do I want to have a victim witness advocate that's our systems-based advocate? Do I want them to meet with that person? I want to give them that avenue to share their story without judgment. If I bring them into my office, everybody knows here what I do at the Clark County Sheriff's Office. So they see one of our officers come in on their off time, out of uniform, door closes. So there's automatically that speculation. And as you all know, law enforcement agencies are little communities. Once somebody comes in my office that's an officer and shuts that door and they're in their regular clothing, there goes the rumor mill, right? Like wildfire. So, how are we protecting that person? What does that look like for that victim? What as an organization or an agency can we do to keep that victim safe? Keep them safe without isolating them even further. Am I going to put them off work? So then I've just isolated them from everybody here at the agency. So what does confidentiality look like inside your agency? All of these things that we need to make sure that we're fleshing out in a policy and procedures. And again, not just under an intimate partner or a domestic violence situation. Like stand alone. How are we going to protect these officers as victims when they come in and have to report to us? What if they can't report to an outside jurisdiction? What if they have to report here? What options do we have available if that officer doesn't want to identify or be seen as a victim? I've been a cop for over 25 years. I venture to say that I've never described myself as a victim. I mean, Jennifer's known me for several years now. I've been involved in a couple of critical incidences. I've had my own incidences that I've dealt with as just a regular citizen, right? I'm pretty sure that she would co-sign on the fact that I've never called myself a victim, right? So how do we even have that conversation? Are we prepared to use good language and good verbiage to keep that dialogue going and not refer to that officer as a victim? Potentially not even refer to them as a victim or survivor. Are we prepared to write? I know a lot of us have to write a narrative in such a way, victim one, victim two. Maybe I don't want to be referred to as a victim because I don't see myself as a victim. And then on the flip side of that, if I say that I'm not a victim, then how do I get that case to court when I don't even think I'm a victim? I had a victim, again, not officer involved at all. I'm not a victim. Anywhere I go, I carry this knife with me. When did you start carrying that knife? Why do you carry it? Right? So when it all comes back to good questions. I don't have to get someone to say they're a victim for me to be able to pull out the information I need to get a good narrative, to help them maybe potentially see some things that are going on, explain what our statute looks like, and then help them get to the point, if they ever want to get to the point, to reporting, and then that going through the criminal justice system.
Denise, I know you and I have had the conversation that oftentimes when you have individuals who might be reluctant to use that word victim or survivor or admit that that's what's happening in their life, asking them questions like, what's changed for you since all of this started?
Yes.
And then we see the pattern of behavior, how they've isolated themselves, they've done all these things differently, can be a way to come about that same conversation, but not using those particular words. And I think one of the things that stands out to me as we've been having this conversation in preparing for this webinar, or just because we're weird and have conversations like this, like, what does this look like for department policies? But I think that policy piece of things is something that we've both talked about a lot. Like, what are we putting in place that our response isn't based just on the credibility or lack of credibility or who's more believable in these particular cases, and making sure that we have a policy that's covering supervision. How are we handling these cases when they're officer involved? Because number one, it helps protect all of us if we have a policy in place, because then we're following the policy. It's not based on who's more credible, who's more likable within the department, if you have both parties that are, at the department. And so really trying to figure out, what does this look like from the supervision standpoint? What happens as far as creating those particular policies?
Right. And not everybody has to be a policy writer to suggest a policy or put forward a policy, right? When I first started the job I'm in now, it wasn't for the gender-based violence role. I had to write policy, and I'm like, oh, like, I've never written policy. Like, I don't even know what this looks like. But you identify the areas in your agency that maybe need a policy, and it protects the employees. So I want to give my employees guidelines, right? They need help in navigating what this looks like. But I also want to protect the organization or the agency, right? I don't want my organization to be sued. But it starts, I think, at the first line supervisor spot, and even could go back a step further and say, FTOs, the field training officers. Field training officers are our culture builders, right? I don't know where it came from. I like it. I try to live by it. The conversation you walk past is the behavior that you tolerate. So as FTOs and first line supervisors, how are we holding ourselves accountable? And then how are we holding the folks that work for us, under us, with us? How are we holding them accountable? As a first line supervisor, as a field training officer, how much interaction do I have with my employees and my coworkers? Can I identify behaviors that may be potentially lead me to believe that this person may be a stalker or may have proclivities towards gender-based violence crimes as an offender, right? Am I And it's not always easy for larger agencies. I'm blessed here at the Clark County Sheriff's Office. We have a smaller organization, and I read all of our reports that come through. And I can tell just sometimes by how a narrative has been written, that officer's not doing so well, right? And I don't mean they're not doing so well at their job. The attention to detail that they typically have isn't there. So that might identify an officer that's maybe a victim or maybe having some additional issues that I need to check in on, right? Am I listening to my officers and the conversations they're having with their coworkers? We stand out in the parking lot every night or every morning or whatever that may look like. And we, as officers, we're human. We talk about our issues. I guarantee you, there's probably somebody that an officer is confiding in if they are a victim. Is that a fellow officer? Have I made myself available for my officers to come and talk to me and start talking about some of the behaviors that they're experiencing? But am I also reading narratives and maybe picking up on language that's not trauma informed, maybe victim blaming, or may lead me to believe that that particular officer again, may be exhibiting behaviors. Am I looking at leads printouts or leads reports to see who my officers are? They jiving up with the people they're interacting with versus the people that we're not interacting with, but we're pulling, we're pulling a tag or we're pulling whatever that may look like. Am I watching body worn camera footage to see what my officers are doing? Right? Am I looking to see that language and that behavior when they're interacting with victims? I'm not always looking for bad things. I also look for things that I need to change in our policy or I need to change in our training because maybe that person just isn't trauma informed or they don't know how to interact with victims. Again, it's about getting to know our employees, right? Yeah. The better I get to know my employees, the better I mentor my employees, the more in tune and in touch with them that I may be, and I may be able to spot a problem, whether it be a perpetrator or a victim early on, and then navigate that and potentially cut that off or help that person versus letting that behavior go. And now we have a significant issue, whether it be a victim or a perpetrator.
Denise, someone pointed out in the chat that you're so right about the impact of FTOs and first line supervisors. I'll say from somebody who's not law enforcement, but does lots of law enforcement training and work with law enforcement, that I can oftentimes tell the culture of what's tolerated and what's not tolerated as related to gender-based violence within 10 minutes of when I'm in an apartment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just by the way people are talking and interacting, et cetera. And so I think it's important to remember that piece of things is also really important to think about how are we working together in those types of relationships? How are we working with advocates? Have we developed those relationships already? Don't wait until you need that relationship to build that relationship because it's too late. Right. But I think you pointed out some really great pieces of that, Denise, where we were talking about, systems-based advocates versus community-based advocates. And would somebody feel comfortable reporting to or working with somebody who's a systems-based advocate? Would they understand the levels of confidentiality that may be there or may not be there? And then, are you really thinking broadly about who might be of assistance in these particular cases? So maybe your policy is to look at, who is a community-based program, who's a systems-based advocate in a different department, like who can people access easily that allows them different reporting options, and how are we building those collaborations, which we all know are so important in these particular cases?
Yeah, and I think it's going outside of our own jurisdiction, right? What is available to me that I can use in my jurisdiction that may not be in the line of my jurisdiction, just to give that victim that extra layer of anonymity, or their business isn't out here for everybody to know instantaneously. I think that's important. Do I have relationships? Haven't even taken the time, and I would love for people to drop in the chat because I always like to learn from people, no matter what the venue may be, right? So you all out here listening to this webinar may have suggestions that I don't even know, right? But like, are we looking outside of just our little comfort zone to get those individuals that victim may be able to report to that don't know our jurisdictional folks, that give that added layer of protection?
Yeah. We've had conversations with folks who are, working on some of those policy decisions, and they're like, well, we have it set up now that, somebody would disclose to an advocate. And I'm like, okay, so tell me more about that. And then it turns out it's a systems-based advocate. And I'm like, and who is in the systems-based advocate's chain of command same people, you know,
Right.
like, so thinking about, you know, what have we set up and that, you know, might, we think makes sense until we start to play it out, as well as, you know, I'm a very big fan of like, if we prepare it and have it at our fingertips, then hopefully we don't need it, but we're going to need it at some point in time. And
Right.
when you need it is not the time to be figuring out
Well,
how
and
that plays into place.
right. And so we regularly put out like mental health um tips and folks that can help us after a critical incident or hope folks that can help us with a myriad of things, right? Are we putting out the same information when it comes to these particular folks? I know we talk about, you know, domestic violence and that co-occurring with stalking, whether it is or it isn't, right? Do our officers know where they can go outside of our own organization to potentially start talking to someone, just to kind of safety plan or get an idea of what's going on? Like I don't know if there are any advocates on this webinar, but I will tell you this, like advocates were trauma informed and doing this well before it was a buzzword for law enforcement, and got us some grant money, right? And they're really, really good at it. They're really, really good at it. And if you're not working with your advocates, you're missing a golden opportunity because they're just sitting around waiting for us, right? They're at the head of every class that I've ever taught. They're asking questions before, during, and after. Like they're just chomping at the bit. And that is just an untapped resource in some places that can really just help elevate us helping our own officers, right? We talk about wellness, and we've been talking about wellness for the past couple of years, really hot and heavy. But like, what are we putting in that wellness program? Like, are we giving our officers access to advocates or other avenues to report gender-based violence crime, you know, to include stalking, but other crimes as well? Like, how comfortable would you be reporting a gender-based violence crime, especially as a male officer? Imagine a male officer trying to come forward and report stalking or domestic violence or sexual assault. You know, so just reaching out and getting those untapped resources is just instrumental.
And I think just the conversation that you and I have had a lot, Denise, and that you and I safety plan very differently.
Yes,
Yours
yes.
is usually a tactical safety plan. Mine is usually an emotional safety plan, neither one of which are wrong.
Correct.
But making sure that we're offering the best that we can offer in these particular cases, right? And so someone's also putting in the chat, it is an advocate in the chat, in healthcare in Boston, who says that they just want to echo your comments, to explore who your community-based advocates are, and where they're based, and get to know what they do. And I would add to that, Lisa, to also say, to make sure that they are knowledgeable in understanding the unique dynamics in stalking, because we have lots of really great domestic violence and sexual assault advocates across the country who are really still just leaning into the stalking work themselves, or might say, well, you know, we work on intimate partner stalking cases, but not just regular stalking cases. And so really trying to make sure that you know what those resources are ahead of time. So thanks for sharing that, Lisa, in the chat. I also want to just call out, as we're looking at those checklists, you know, for your agency in general, really trying to think about what are you doing to encourage individuals who might be impacted by these particular crimes to come forward and to be able to reach out to their own agency, to make a report to your agency if they're you know, being victimized by one of your own officers. And thinking about, you know, some of those things. You know, I feel like we've talked about policies and protocols a lot, but, you know, I want to echo what you say, Denise, when, you know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of really brilliant people on this webinar, not just the people who have their cameras on. So I think if there's, you know, if there's things that you want to put in the chat, but reach out to LETAC, reach out to Nolly, to Spark, and we can help you come up with some of those policies. If you have really great policies already, share them with the rest of us so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But I think also talking about some of that training and response, if you're doing training on stalking in your own agency, are you talking about what to do with an officer involved stalking case? A lot of training across the country, you know, people are like, oh, we offer a stalking training. I'm like, awesome. And then I start, you know, we start to look at and really distill what's going on. And I'm like, so do you talk about officer involved stalking? And they're like, well, you know, that doesn't happen here. I'm like, well, we don't talk about it. But also, you know, what kind of information is being put out, like you said, in those bulletins about mental health and those other regular contacts that we're having within our own department. what kind of messages are we putting out to let people know that there is resources available in the department, what the mechanism for reporting it would be. I always laugh a little bit when we go into jurisdictions where we ask about, do you know what your policy is on officer involved stalking? And then everybody like is looking at each other. Like, so if you do have one, make sure it's not a secret or buried on page 953 of your SOP manual, because that's not going to be super helpful. So how are you also providing that information to everyone else? Denise, why did this hour go by really fast?
It always does. I told
that-
you talk more than what you think you do.
Me? I talk more than what we'll table that conversation. But would love to hear from all of you in the chat if there are things that are standing out to you from our conversation today, or things that Nolly and LETAC can help you with as we look forward to wrapping up our time together. And everybody's going to be radio silent. That's how it always works, right? I noticed Josh come back. I do want to put up our contact information for all of these organizations in case you're not familiar with all of them. Nolly's website, Spark's website, and of course the LETAC website, so that you can begin to engage in some of these conversations. Yeah. Yep, absolutely. We always want to make sure that we cover not only officer perpetrated, but officers as victims as well. So anything else?
Well, I'm not seeing any questions coming in, just a lot of thank yous. I want to echo the thank yous for both of you being on here. This was great information. We did record this, so we'll send out the recording to everybody who registered. So if you had to step away or do anything, hopefully it wasn't Jen and Denise that had to step away at any point while they were presenting. But thank you both so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. We love collaborations like this and look forward to doing more work with you all on this topic and others. So thank you and have a great rest of your day. Be safe and let us know if you need anything.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.